Welcome to the GEMDS video training series. In this video, I'll be discussing the importance of the firewall and NAT configuration in the ORBIT MCR cellular interface. First, I'll begin with an introduction of how the firewall applies to the cellular interface, explain why we need it, and show an example of its importance. Then I will show each pre-configured firewall filter and explain its function. After that, I'll show which filters are used by default in the cellular interface and how you can modify them to add additional rules. I'll also cover what the local nets parameter means and how you should configure it for your system. At the end, I'll briefly touch on NAT and its importance in the cellular interface. Let's start by explaining how the firewall is involved in the cell interface. Each ORBIT interface needs an input and output filter. If no filters are applied to an interface, the firewall will block all data. Factory default settings on the ORBIT contain 4 pre-configured firewall filters to use: in trusted, out trusted, in untrusted, and out untrusted, and we will review each one of these later in the video. In all ORBIT MCR 4G and 3G units, the cell interface comes pre-configured to use in untrusted and out untrusted for the input and output filters respectively. Both of these provide strict filtering on data packets entering and leaving the cell interface, which allows the ORBIT to be very secure. One of the primary features inside an ORBIT MCR 3G or 4G is its connectivity to the public cellular network. Since the cellular interface is connected on the public domain, this gives a user access from a remote location. This makes managing devices and polling networks very easy, as the private office on the left can monitor the RTU devices on the right. However, this also allows anyone else on the public domain the ability to communicate with the ORBIT if they obtain the ORBIT cellular IP address. As pictured here, an external host named HackerGuy saw your cellular IP address pass through the public domain. He may attempt to connect to the ORBIT via SSH to take control. How can you prevent outsiders from attacking the network? The firewall. Ultimately, the ORBIT's firewall functions to protect your networks and manage what data is allowed to pass in and out of the ORBIT. Now that we understand how important the firewall is when using the public cellular interface, let's review the pre-configured firewall filters and decide which best fits your system. By default, the ORBIT comes with 4 preconditioned firewall filters. A filter is just a group of rules that are used to define what traffic is allowed in and out of an ORBIT interface. Each interface needs to have an input filter and an output filter. If no filters are configured for an interface, by default the firewall will block all traffic from entering or leaving that interface. 2 of the pre-configured filters are input filters, and the other 2 are output filters. One input and output filter is used for trusted interfaces, primarily when connected with local networks, and one input and output filter is used for untrusted interfaces, such as the cellular interface connected to the public domain. Here is a breakdown of the Untrusted Filter. As mentioned before, this filter should be used on interfaces connected on a local network. It will allow all data to pass through the firewall into the ORBIT, but the user also has the ability to add specific deny rules that will block unwanted traffic. The ORBIT by default has this filter applied to the bridge interface. Here is the in untrusted filter. This filter is the strict version of the untrusted filter. This filter should be used on interfaces connected on a public network. It'll only allow ICMP and DNS data to pass through the firewall into the ORBIT, plus any user-configured rules allowing additional traffic types. The ORBIT by default has this filter applied to the cell interface. Here is the out-trusted filter. This filter should be used on interfaces connected on a local network. It will allow all data to pass through the firewall out of the ORBIT, but the user also has the ability to add specific deny rules that will block unwanted outgoing traffic. The ORBIT by default has this filter applied to the bridge interface. The last pre-configured filter is the out untrusted filter. This filter is the strict version of the out trusted filter. This filter should be used on an interface connected to the public network. It'll allow only local nets data to pass through the firewall into the ORBIT, plus any user-configured rules allowing additional traffic types. Local nets is used to define an address or subnet of addresses. The Orbit's firewall uses these addresses to determine what is allowed to be sent out of an interface configured with the out untrusted filter. The Orbit by default has this filter applied to the cell interface. It's very important to update the local nets parameter to include all of your local subnets connected to the Orbit that wish to route out of the cellular interface. Network Address Translation, or NAT, is also pre-configured to your cell interface. The rule can be found in your firewall settings under NAT, called mask. It's very important to not modify the mask rule unless you are doing IPsec or one-to-one NAT. See these videos for more information. There is also an extensive training series video on ORBIT and NAT, and I highly recommend checking that out. Well, that wraps up the importance for firewall and NAT configuration in the ORBIT MCR cellular interface. I hope this video was helpful for you, and for additional information, please visit our website at www.gemds.com.